In a dramatic escalation of economic warfare, President Donald Trump has unleashed a bold and incendiary threat, targeting the BRICS nations, Brazil, Russia, India, China, and South Africa, with an unprecedented 150% tariff on their exports. His chilling warning is clear. Any BRICS nation daring to explore alternatives to the US dollar will face devastating tariffs. But what exactly is behind this aggressive stance? According to Trump, BRICS is actively working to dismantle the US dollar's supremacy in global finance, aiming to create an independent financial system that could challenge America's control and potentially give rise to a new world order free from US influence. However, this raises an unsettling question. If BRICS were truly inconsequential, why would the US escalate its threats to such extremes? If the US dollar were as invincible as Washington claims, why would it risk a high-stakes economic war against a coalition of nations that seemingly poses no serious threat? The answer is alarming. America is panicking. For over a century, the US dollar has held the coveted position of the global reserve currency, solidifying America's unmatched power over international trade and finance. This dominance has forced countries around the world to stockpile US dollars, settle transactions in USD, and rely on American-controlled financial systems like SWIFT. With this immense power, the U.S. has been able to manipulate global markets, print money without consequence, and impose crippling sanctions on any nation that defies its will. But now, BRICS is directly challenging this long-standing financial order, and Trump's extreme response reveals the depth of the perceived threat. This is not just a trade dispute, it's a seismic shift in the global power balance, one that Washington is desperate to prevent at all costs. At the heart of America's financial empire lies the petro-dollar system. In the 1970s, the U.S. struck a pivotal deal with Saudi Arabia, ensuring that all global oil transactions would be conducted in U.S. This agreement forced every nation importing oil to hold large reserves of USD, artificially inflating the dollar's value and sustaining global demand. But now, BRICS nations are dismantling this arrangement. China and Russia have already abandoned the dollar, opting instead to conduct the majority of their trade in yuan and rubles. India, meanwhile, has been purchasing Russian oil in rupees, bypassing the dollar entirely in energy transactions. Even more troubling, Saudi Arabia and the UAE, two of America's most reliable energy partners, are considering accepting yuan for oil sales. This signals a dangerous shift, as even Washington's closest allies begin exploring alternatives to the dollar. This is no longer a distant possibility. It's happening in real time. The International Monetary Fund, IMF, has confirmed that the US dollar's dominance is waning. In 2000, the dollar accounted for more than 70% of global reserves. By 2023, that figure had dropped to just 58%, with the trend continuing as more nations turn away from the dollar. Meanwhile, China's digital yuan is being tested for use in international oil trade, signaling that the days of the dollar's monopoly over global transactions could soon be over. This marks a monumental shift in the global financial landscape, one that Washington is struggling to contain. If BRICS succeeds in establishing an alternative global reserve currency, the consequences for the U.S. could be catastrophic. The loss of the dollar's central role would strip America of its most powerful geopolitical tool, the ability to control global finance. Without the dollar's dominance, the U.S. would no longer be able to impose sanctions, control capital flows, or manipulate markets as it has for decades. This isn't just about trade policies. It's about the U.S. fighting to retain control over a world that is increasingly slipping beyond its grasp. Trump understands the stakes. If BRICS continues with its dollarization strategy, the global demand for U.S. dollars will diminish, potentially leading to an economic crisis in Washington. America's economy, built on debt, relies heavily on global demand for the dollar. If nations begin trading in their own currencies, the artificial demand for the dollar will vanish, sparking runaway inflation and further eroding America's economic power on the world stage. This is why Trump is so vehemently opposed to BRICS's financial ambitions. The rise of BRICS isn't just about creating a new currency, it's about dismantling a global financial system in which the U.S. no longer calls the shots. Trump's 150% tariff threat is framed as a show of strength, a way to force BRICS into submission. But in reality, the situation is far more complex and ominous. Rather than breaking BRICS, Trump's tariffs may only accelerate the global movement away from U.S. economic dominance. At the 2023 BRICS summit, the group expanded rapidly, welcoming 5 new countries, Egypt, Ethiopia, Indonesia, Iran, and the UAE into its ranks. This marks one of the largest geopolitical shifts in decades, as more countries turn to BRICS as a counterbalance to the US-led financial order. And BRICS's expansion is far from over. Argentina, Saudi Arabia, Nigeria, and Thailand are all in talks to join the bloc, further strengthening its influence. This expansion signals that BRICS is gaining ground, and the tariffs that Trump has imposed have done little to slow this momentum. In fact, Trump's reliance on tariffs as a tool of economic warfare has been ineffective in the past. In 2018, he imposed tariffs on China in an effort to force the country to change its trade practices. But rather than capitulating, China retaliated, slashing agricultural imports from the US and crippling American farmers. Prices for consumer goods surged and manufacturing jobs declined. Tariffs proved to be a failed strategy. Now, with his latest threat of a 150% tariff on BRICS nations, Trump risks repeating his past mistakes. But this time, the consequences could be even more damaging for the U.S. economy. The U.S. heavily relies on imports from BRICS countries, including electronics, rare earth metals, pharmaceuticals, and agricultural products. A significant disruption to this trade would wreak havoc on American industries, driving up costs and accelerating inflation. In the end, Trump's aggressive tactics could backfire, accelerating the very shift in global power he's desperately trying to prevent. The question remains, will Trump's economic threats succeed in curbing BRICS's ambitions, or will they backfire, leading to a catastrophic strategic failure for the U.S.? If these goods are hit with crippling tariffs, American companies will be forced to raise prices, leading to a surge in inflation and further weakening the U.S. economy. Meanwhile, BRICS nations have a range of alternatives. China can shift its exports to Africa and Latin America, while Russia has significantly boosted its energy trade with India and the Middle East. Brazil and South Africa, key exporters of food and natural resources, are expanding their trade relationships with China and Europe. In contrast, the U.S. is becoming increasingly isolated with every move it makes. Trump's tariff strategy is set to fail. Rather than weakening BRICS, these tariffs will only push the group to accelerate its plans for economic independence. Each time Washington targets BRICS economically, the bloc finds new ways to reduce its reliance on the U.S., leaving Washington increasingly powerless in a divided world. The U.S. is growing more isolated. Trump's aggressive tariff policies aren't just failing to weaken BRICS, they're isolating the U.S. from the rest of the world. As BRICS nations strengthen their economic ties, the U.S. is losing influence, even among its closest allies. Take the European Union, for example. Trump's trade wars with Mexico, Canada, and Europe have pushed these nations to seek alternatives to U.S.-dominated financial systems. The EU is increasingly concerned about U.S. sanctions, with many countries now exploring the use of alternative currencies like the yuan and euro for international trade. The EU is growing weary of relying on a financial system controlled by Washington, and nations are prioritizing partnerships outside U.S. influence. But Europe is not alone. China and Russia's bilateral trade reached a record $240 billion in 2023, and the U.S. finds itself on the wrong side of history. The U.S. has failed to isolate Russia with sanctions, and India is deepening its energy ties with Moscow, moving away from the U.S.-dominated oil market. Even Africa, once a close ally of the West, is strengthening its economic ties with China, with trade between the two reaching $282 billion in 2023. In this new world, the U.S. is no longer calling the shots. Rather than maintaining a dominant, unchallenged economic order, Washington is becoming increasingly isolated on the global stage, while BRICS is thriving in the vacuum the U.S. has created. The inevitable shift toward a multipolar world is already underway. So what's next for BRICS? The bloc is no longer simply reacting to U.S. economic threats. They're actively building a financial system that could forever reshape global trade and finance. A significant development is Russia's proposal for a gold-backed BRICS currency, which could rival the U.S. dollar in international trade. A currency backed by tangible commodities like gold and natural resources would offer stability, protection against inflation, and a secure alternative to fiat currencies controlled by Western central banks. China is leading the charge in digital finance, with its digital yuan already being tested for international oil transactions. This is proving that the US dollar is no longer the only viable option for global trade. As more countries adopt China's digital currency, the US dollar's dominance is further undermined. The Petro-dollar system, which has kept the US dollar at the center of global oil trade for decades, is teetering on the brink of collapse. If major oil producers like Saudi Arabia and Russia begin accepting payments in yuan instead of dollars, it could signal the end of US economic hegemony. The implications are staggering. Will Trump's tariffs work? One thing is certain. Trump's 150% tariffs will not deter BRICS from pursuing its financial independence. If anything, these tariffs will only strengthen the bloc's resolve to break free from the US-led economic order. As BRICS expands its financial networks, more countries will join the movement to create a multipolar world where power is shared, not concentrated in Washington. The US is running out of ways to stop this shift. Trump's tariff threats are not a sign of strength. They are a desperate, last-ditch effort to preserve a dying economic system. The U.S. is no longer in control of the global economy, and BRICS is showing that nations can thrive without relying on the dollar. As more countries embrace dollar alternatives, build independent trade networks, and adopt new financial systems, America's grip on global finance continues to slip. The era of U.S. economic dominance is drawing to a close, and the future belongs to a multipolar world led by BRICS. The question remains, how long can the U.S. delay the inevitable? Do you think Trump's tariffs can stop BRICS? Let us know in the comments below, and don't forget to like, share, and subscribe to stay informed on the latest developments in geopolitics, the global economy, and the shifting world order. This is just the beginning. Stay tuned for more in-depth analysis of the changing global landscape.